Hey guys, still not 100%. I'm planning on leaving tomorrow from Seattle, which I don't know if it's the sort of smartest thing, honestly, to do, but I think I want to do it. I'm kind of getting a little stir crazy. I want to see if I can at least try and see Yellowstone, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. Today, I am, once again, it's going to be my second trip to a cemetery, and pretty soon later today, it'll be my 7th trip to an REI. But I'm at another gravesite here, but this isn't the family gravesite. This is actually a gravesite that I've always wanted to go to in Seattle, which, for those of you guys who don't know, Bruce Lee is buried here. And so it's something that I did want to do, is visit his gravesite and pay some respects. Maybe I'll have some other words about it. Somewhere around here, I imagine it's one of these larger plots, but we'll see where he is. So I was told that this was a pretty popular site, and I didn't realize, because I figured I'd be the only person here on a weekday, but I'm definitely not. There's a bunch of other people who are coming to pay respects, so I'm gonna let them clear out, and maybe I'll say some words. So Bruce Lee and Brandon Lee are actually buried here. And maybe I'll explain when I have some extra time why it is that I wanted to come here specifically. But it's kind of interesting thing that it's sort of like a tourist destination here, for people to come in and I guess hopefully pay their respects and to see the very place of a remarkable person and a great Chinese American. So hopefully we'll let them kind of clear out. We'll talk more about that. So a lot of you are probably going to ask, why am I here at another cemetery, and why specifically Bruce Lee? I think I'm going to go for a little bit of a walk here. Essentially, I always wanted to visit Bruce Lee's gravesite because, I'm not a martial artist. I like kung fu movies, but I'm not a movie fan in that way. But I really have to kind of pay respects to him and the things that he had done for progressing the agenda of integrating Asian Americans more into kind of mainstream culture and society. I found out about him, everybody knows about Bruce Lee, right? But I started really kind of knowing a little bit more about him as a person in college, and why I think he was such a big influence on me is that I ended up finding out that he was a philosophy person. He introduced me to the very, very first times I read his writings on Taoism, which are kind of still an influence on me. And besides that, I think the biggest thing that he was such a big influence on for me, and I think a lot of other Asian Americans, especially Asian men, is what he did for us as, I guess in terms of our representation. Representations of Asians before Bruce Lee certainly were not positive, not many of them. Representations of Asian men before Bruce Lee were definitely not particularly positive either. And he had to kind of have his own sort of battles and struggles with racism, my understanding, to a certain extent as well. And so I think that Bruce Lee, one of his biggest contributions was just, he made these amazing contributions to martial arts, at least popularization of it, to the film industry. He was a singularly unique individual in terms of his philosophy and his personality. I think the biggest impact for me is what he did, like I said, for us as Asian Americans and Asian men as well. I think that he presented a view of Asian American masculinity that was not ever heard of, that was this incredibly confident, kind of cocky, arrogant sort of aspect version of himself that I don't think anyone would ever expect from someone who is Asian American or Asian, that kind of thing. And even as much as I think his version of that was very kind of unique to him, I appreciate that he kind of expanded the possibilities of what people thought Asian, and specifically Asian men, could be like. The funny thing is that for him, I call him an Asian American because he was an Asian American. He was born in America. He spent a lot of his time in America. He was actually he was partially European in some sort of ancestry, but his view of this masculinity, I think actually was very Western, and it was a kind of masculinity that was completely unapologetic for who he was, what he was, for what he stood for. And I think that's something that would appeal to a lot of people, and I think that's something that appealed to Western sensibilities. I kind of admire him for who he was and his personality and what he did, and expanding the boundaries, like I said, as he did, just by sort of being himself, doing his job as an actor. He had a big influence on me when I was younger, in terms of having, I don't know if I would call him a role model, but having someone to kind of look up to, and to know that, like I said, that we had at least some representation in some way, and that he was maybe the first of his kind. So that's sort of why I'm paying respects to him. He, I guess, to me, it reminds me of a eulogy for Malcolm X that I can't remember his name had written when Malcolm X had died. He said that Malcolm was their manhood, their shining black manhood. And I think that in some ways, for those of us who are Asian Americans, when Bruce Lee died, or the fact that Bruce Lee existed and passed away, he was kind of like that for us. And as much as I think, like I said, he was a unique and singular person, I think he was somebody who had a similar forthrightness in who he was, and refusal to kind of back down or change who he would be, despite what it is that American society wanted of people like him at the time. So that's why I respect him. Now, I also have to say that, this is not sort of complete just hero worship for me. Bruce Lee was a very, just like any other human, kind of flawed person. I've heard, not surprisingly, that he's kind of an asshole, that he could be prone to fits of anger. My friend who I know who studied martial arts said that he'd heard stories that Bruce Lee, at one point in time, basically in a fit of road rage, like got out of his car and beat the crap out of some guy who had offended him or something like that. He was not a perfect man. I heard rumors that he was a womanizer. If I was that charismatic, maybe that would be a temptation too. I don't know that was really the best, not the best aspect of his personality or his character. So he's clearly flawed. I'm not here to sort of say that he was the greatest human being on earth, but I want to be able to at least sort of pay respects to, what he's done in the whole, in the large picture. Now, Brandon Lee, I didn't talk that much about either, but I actually think that Brandon Lee is more of a tragedy. His death was more of a tragedy because he died just as his career was getting started. For those of you guys don't know, he was in a movie called The Crow. He was very, very good in it, but in the middle of the filming, an accident with a blank firing pistol that had been loaded with some form of projectile ended up getting shot into his head, and I think it was his head, and he died. So I think Brandon Lee actually, if anything, was more of a tragedy than Bruce Lee dying, even though Bruce Lee did die very young. It would have been nice to see him sort of carry on the legacy of his father, and it's interesting to think about what Hollywood would have looked like if Brandon Lee had still been alive. Some people joke that Keanu Reeves would basically wouldn't have a job if Brandon Lee was still around. Maybe that's true. But there's even more people. A lot of people pay respects to Brandon and Bruce Lee. But that's sort of what I wanted to say about them. I really respect both of them. Again, they're not by any means sort of perfect human beings, and not all of the things that they've done really should be lauded. And not every aspect of who they were should be completely kind of taken at face value as good. But at least for me, specifically Bruce Lee came for me at a time where I really think it was a good thing to have a role model, somebody to kind of look up to in popular culture. Even if I don't really think I'm much like him, but just somebody to look up to. That's something I think that if you're a member of the majority culture, I think it's hard to kind of understand what it's like to kind of go through your day-to-day life and not have, any role models that look or sound like you or identify the way that you do, and how much that really means to have those role models. I think it's very important for those people who are minorities that they have at least some kind of role models out there in pop culture, because it's sort of like, you can take it for granted if you're a member of the majority culture that everybody sort of looks like you. You don't have that affiliation, but when you're in a member of minority culture, because you're in the minority, there's a desire to have, see other people who maybe are from your background or have, you can identify with in some way, like out there in the public, sort of like to have a sense of kinship with people out there in the world and not necessarily feel like our stories aren't being told or that kind of thing. So this video's gone on for quite a while, but I guess that's just all I wanted to say about Bruce Lee and Brandon Lee. And like I said, I respect them. For me, learning about Bruce Lee came at a very important time in my life, and I've always wanted to kind of pay respects to him for all the things that he's done in his career, but also, like I said, for America as an American and as an Asian American. So.